Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to a new chapter today, which we are going to be discussing. And this is chapter number 6. Okay. So, we are now in part 3 of the textbook. So, if I just go back, part 1, the goal was to give you an overview about operating systems, and part 1 covered chapters 1 and 2, right? So chapters 1 and 2 were covered in part 1, give an overview of operating systems, some of the most important concepts, user interfaces, system calls, and so on, right? Part 2 was on titled process management, right? So process management, so in this we did chapters 3, 4 and 5. Chapter 3 introduced the concept of processes, talked about process control blocks, an introduction to process scheduling, various system calls with regards to processes, right, fork, exec, wait, exit, different ways in which processes can communicate with each other, using shared memory, using pipes and so on, inter-process communication, IPC. So process management, that was chapter 3. Chapter 4 was on threads and concurrency, right? So concurrency means at any point of time, many processes are executing. So concurrency. So we discussed threads and concurrency. So how, given a process, we can divide it into certain number of threads which can run in parallel, and we can get the desired concurrency. So that was the topic of chapter 4. Chapter 5 was CPU scheduling. So if at any time our run queue has a certain number of processes in it, then how do we pick the order of executing those processes, the sequence of process execution? So CPU scheduling answers that question. So that was part 2, talking about processes, threads and scheduling processes. Now we shift gears and move to part 3 of the book, and this is called process synchronization. Okay, process synchronization. Okay. So first of all, what do we mean by synchronization? What is the classic textbook or dictionary definition of synchronization, without confining ourselves to operating systems, right? So very simply put, if I look at Wikipedia, it says synchronization is the coordination of events to operate a system in unison as one. So something which is sort of coordinated, right? Some actions which are coordinated. So for example, synchronized dancers, right? One example in which all the dancers synchronize their steps. So if one is raising their leg, the other will also raise their leg. All of them will do that. And whatever steps they do in perfect synchronization. They ensure that all the steps done by all the dancers are sort of happening at the same time. So step 1 happens at the same time. Step 2 happens at the same time. So it looks like all the events or all the steps have been coordinated to operate a system in unison as one. Okay, so that is synchronization. So this concept applies to operating systems as well, especially with regards to processes. Okay, so why exactly do we need synchronization among processes? So we note that again I'm quoting from the book. A system or an operating system typically consists of several, perhaps hundreds or even thousands of processes or threads running concurrently. Okay. So threads often share user data, right? They often have shared data that they access. For example, shared memory, right? That is an example in which we designate a portion of memory as shared, and then many processes can read from it, write to it. Okay. So the operating system continuously updates various data structures to support multiple threads. Okay. A race condition exists when access to shared data is not controlled, possibly resulting in corrupt data values. So the main problem, as we'll see, with the when we have processes trying to access shared data, the main problem here is in what order are they doing those shared operations. Okay. So for example, if both are writing to the same data at the same time, that will not be a good idea, because if they write at the same time, of course you will get some gibberish which you can't understand, right? So you want to avoid that, right? So this is what we call a race condition, when accesses to shared data by multiple processes or threads is not controlled, possibly resulting in corruption of that data. So we will soon see. A race condition is a process by which you have multiple processes or threads trying to access the shared data in some manner, and because that access to the data by the multiple processes or threads is not controlled, that can lead to corruption in data or incorrect values, which we don't want, or some value which is not good for the system, which is not right, which may not be fair. So that is a race condition, and in this chapter we'll learn more about what race conditions are, and why they are a problem and why we should avoid them. So process synchronization involves using tools that control access to shared data to avoid race conditions. So the idea is to avoid race conditions by controlling how processes can access data. So there are various tools for controlling access to shared data. So we will look at some of those tools here. Okay. These tools must be used carefully, as their incorrect use can result in poor system performance, including a deadlock. So in this is chapter 6, which we'll cover. In chapter 7 we have a peculiar case, which is a byproduct of process synchronization, in which we have a unique condition called a deadlock, which results in a bunch of processes being stalled and not able to make any progress. Okay. So we have to use these synchronization tools carefully. So that is in general an essence of what this chapter is about: process synchronization. Okay. Okay, so now I am on slide 2, and as we have done in the previous chapters, this slide is dedicated to the roadmap or blueprint for this chapter. So first we start with some background and introduction. Okay. Then we move on to formally define the critical section problem, which is at the heart of process synchronization. Okay. And finally we will next step would be to discuss some of the potential solutions to the critical section problem. So we'll start with Peterson's solution, and then we'll discuss other solutions that solve the critical section problem. So we'll discuss what the critical section problem is. It's definitely a synchronization related problem. So we'll discuss what it is, and then we'll discuss some solutions for this. So one of those popular solutions is semaphores. So we'll see what these semaphores are and how they can solve this critical section and this synchronization problem. So next we'll talk about and we'll discuss some of the classic problems of synchronization: the bounded buffer problem, the reader-writers problem, the dining philosopher's problem. So what is common in all of these problems will be we can have a bunch of processes or threads trying to access the shared data, and we have to control those accesses so that our data is not in an inconsistent or in an incorrect state. Okay. So again, all of these will make sense as we move on. Okay. And then we look at some synchronization problems, examples, in Windows XP or Linux. So how does XP do synchronization? How does Linux do synchronization? We'll look at all of that. Okay. Okay. Now I am on slide 3, and now we talk about objectives. So as you know, related to the roadmap or related to the blueprint, we have a set of objectives for each chapter. So what are the objectives for chapter number 6? First, it's simple. First objective is to introduce the critical section problem, right, whose solutions can be used to ensure consistency of shared data. So we learned that because of this critical section problem, because of this lack of synchronization among processes trying to access shared data, data could be in an inconsistent or incorrect state. So we first define what the problem is. This a data consistency problem. We call it the critical section problem. And then finally we discuss some solutions to the critical section problem. So the idea is control the accesses by processes or threads to the shared data. So do access control so that this critical section problem does not arise and our data is in a proper and consistent state. So these are the objectives of this chapter: to introduce a critical section problem and then to discuss some solutions to this problem. Okay. Okay, now I am on slide number 4, and the title of this slide is cooperating processes. So we touched this a bit in the earlier chapters. I think it was it may have been chapter number 3. Okay. So what we are saying is processes can fall under 2 buckets. Okay. Processes can be independent or they can be cooperating. Right. So we discussed this in chapter number 5, which is scheduling as well. In the multiprocessor scheduling algorithm, we had edges going from one process to the other, and those processes were related. A process could not start till it received the results from all of its predecessor processes. So those are cooperating processes which can affect or be affected by the execution of another process. So let's say 2 processes need to communicate, right? Parent process opens a file, writes to that file, and child process reads from it. So this parent and child are definitely cooperating processes, right? They can affect, or they can be, one process can affect, or it can be affected by the execution of another process, right? So they are cooperating. The parent creates a file, writes to that file, and child reads from it. And on the other hand, we have independent processes which cannot affect or be affected by the execution of another process. So in other words, they can run independently, right? So perhaps a video game and a Word document could be independent. So bottom line is, if processes are independent, so execution of one process does not affect the execution of the other process. They can run independently in parallel. If processes are cooperating, then well, yes, the execution of one process does depend upon the execution of another process. So in general, they will be, sharing information, or they will be, accessing some shared data. Those are some examples, right? So what are the advantages of process cooperation? As we discussed earlier, information sharing, right? Sharing a file over the internet, computational speed up by breaking a large task or process into smaller subtasks or smaller sub-processes and executing each subtask or sub-process on a separate CPU. Finally, you combine the results. So if you have a very large process, let's say sorting an array of 1,000,000 entries, well, perhaps you divide that into smaller sub-processes or smaller threads. Each thread, sorting 1/4 or 1/4 entries, and then they run in parallel. Each runs on a separate CPU, and finally you combine the results. So now, because of the so why do we do this? So that we can use the multiple CPUs available and we can get a computation speed up. So the final application finishes much earlier than it would when everything was sequential, when there was only one thread. Okay. So here in the second case, non-sequential case, you have 250,000 entry arrays, 4 of them, and they are all getting sorted in parallel. So naturally your final result will come earlier. Right. So now all these 4 sub processes or these four threads, they are they can be said that as cooperating. Right, because once one thread finishes, then it waits for the others, and then when all 4 threads, because note that although they are all 250,000 entries, they may not finish at the same time. So one thread finishes, it has to wait for the other to finish, and then once the results are obtained from all 4 threads, then the original process can combine the results. So advantages of cooperation among processes is information sharing, computation speed up, and so on. So in general, cooperation among processes is a good idea, right? So it makes sense to have cooperating processes. Now one side effect, which we again, as we know in engineering and computer science is no exception, there is always a cost to everything. So by using process cooperation, we are sharing information, we are getting computation speed up, our applications are finishing faster. So those are the good things, but we also have a price to pay. There is some side effect, there is some added cost, some overhead, and that is now we need synchronization among processes. So looking at the file read and write, now the child should not start reading till the parent has written. So it should wait, and then once the parent writes, is finishing writing, then child should resume, read it, and that's it. We don't want the child to start reading while the parent, before the parent has written, or maybe even while the parent is writing. Perhaps once the parent has written, then the child can read. So we need some synchronization. Likewise among the threads, the parent thread or the parent process in that array sorting routine, the parent process has to wait for the results of all 4 threads, each sorting 250,000 array sizes. So the parent thread has to wait for all of them. So some synchronization is needed, right? Whenever we have cooperation among processes. Okay. So in this chapter we will be focusing on the case in which multiple processes or multiple threads are doing reads or writes to a shared data. So we looked at shared memory in chapter 3. So when we have this shared memory going on, synchronization is necessary. So we'll soon see why. So now I am on slide number 5. We're still talking about cooperating processes. So how about some real life examples of cooperating processes, right? So let's say 2 files communicating using a pipe. So we just talked about this. Parent creates, so there's a pipe which is created by the parent. Once it is successfully created, it returns 2 file descriptors, one for reading, one for writing. Parent writes to the pipe, child reads from it. So clearly we need some synchronization. First we let the parent write and then the child reads. Doesn't make sense for the child to read if nothing has been written. So you can clearly see a need for synchronization. In that example, how we did that? The child waited. Okay, child can wait. Okay. Another example, ls more. So ls lists the contents of the current directory, and more, if I am not wrong, is useful when you have output that is quite long, and that is going beyond what is occupied by the dimensions of your shell. So let's say your shell size is such, when you're doing ls, 10 files are printed. Now let's say in your current directory you have 100 files. So the way it will work is, first it will only print 10, and then you will scroll with your mouse, go down to see the rest of the files. Now you can format this output in a easy to read way by using this more. So what this will do is this will put output worth only one page of the shell, whatever can be accommodated, and then you can hit a particular key. I think generally it's a space bar, and if you click the space bar once, it takes you to page number 2, files 11 to 20, and then you hit the space key again, takes you to page 3, files 21 to 30, and then hit space page 4, hit page space 5. So a way of formatting. So bottom line is ls and more both are processes, and you need synchronization among them. Essentially what that means is the output of ls is fed as input to more. Doesn't make sense for more to execute before ls is executed, because there is no output to format, right? Another one, two processes in an airline reservation system trying to grab a particular seat on the airplane, right? So worst case it's the last seat, because what can happen is it's only one seat, and 2 or even more people are trying to reserve that, and the question is, if 10 people try to reserve it at the same time, who does the seat get allocated to? So clearly it's you need some kind of synchronization among these processes. So next we look at some more examples. Okay, so now I am on slide 6, and let us elaborate this ticket reservation example a bit. So maybe you would have experienced this, at least I have. So we need to book a train ticket. Of course, we go to the IRCTC website, right? So we open the app, or open the website on our desktop or laptop browser. Okay. Now, what we observe is, 4 tickets are left. Okay. What we observe is 4 tickets are left. So fine, we go ahead and fill in the data. Right, we fill in the data, and we go to the payments option and pay, and then finally, generally payment option takes time, and then once we do the payment, we see that although the ticket is booked, but rather than getting a confirmed seat, the waiting list is now 1. So clearly not a desirable situation. Why did this occur? Because or why may have this occurred? May this situation have occurred? Probably because multiple users were trying to book the tickets at the same time, and there was no synchronization mechanism. So perhaps they could have a mechanism in which if you're trying to book a ticket and there are less tickets and more people trying to book at the same time, then the system allows you to sort of have a quote unquote hold on the ticket, right? So if you have a hold on the ticket, what that means is you're trying to book it, which means maybe for 2 minutes you have a hold on it. If you don't book within that time period, the ticket is released to other people. So that could be one synchronization mechanism. But clearly what happened here was there are more people interested than tickets that are left, and by the time there was no hold put on your ticket, no hold put, and eventually the time that you filled in your details and did the payment, the ticket went to somebody else. Right, so clearly if you have some kind of synchronization, that would be sort of a bit fair for all. Okay. All right, so now I am on slide number 7, and now we discuss a couple of problems in greater detail. So up to now we were sort of talking at the top what is going on, and maybe this is a problem, therefore there is no synchronization, and therefore we get all kinds of undesirable output. Now let's sort of talk in a more concrete manner. Okay, so synchronization problem number 1, a printer queue. So we all use printers, and generally we may have a printer connected to a computer lab, and that printer could be a networked printer, which means all the machines in the lab are hooked onto that printer. So what happens is from time to time students or faculty give print commands, and the commands which are given are put into the printer queue, right, put into the printer queue, and then based on the contents of the queue we process the printer jobs. So you would also have seen, if you have type a command, or select an option to print any document, you see opening up of a printer queue, and then based on whatever is in the queue, those requests are processed. Here what we have is, we have a network printer, so many people in the lab can give print commands, and then it goes to a printer queue, and then according to the that queue, the commands are processed. Okay. So what we have here is a directory, right? So we have a spooler directory, what we call. So if we just see what it means, so spooler is a small application that manages the paper printing job sent from a computer to a printer or print server. Okay, so a small application that manages the paper printing jobs sent from a process to a printer or print server. Okay, it enables storing multiple print jobs within a print queue or a buffer where it is retrieved by the printer. So once again, because this process is involved, printing process is involved, so there is a special process or thread which is dedicated to handling these print requests. So spooler is one small application that does that. It manages the printing of several jobs, several documents on a printer. So it will as part of its job, the spooler will maintain the print queue or print buffer. So here we are seeing that print queue, print buffer, and which sort of looks like an array, and in each cell we see the name of some, it's probably the name of some file. Okay, so at index 4 we have file abc, index 5 prog.c, C file looks like, index 6 prog.n, right, and then we have many two processes trying to access the printer, and then we have two variables, out and in, right. So what do these mean? So here we see an example of a printer. So this printer is a shared resource, I think it's well established, shared resource which is shared among all the users in that lab, and its job is to print files. So if a process needs to print a file, it enters the file name in the spooler directory. Another process, say a printer daemon. So daemon is a process which periodically runs in a background. There can be many kinds of daemon processes. One of the daemon processes that runs in the background is a printer daemon. So name of this daemon process could be LPD, and its job is to periodically check if there are any files to be printed. So periodically it will start running, and if there are files to be printed, it will print them. If not, it will go back to sleep and again wake up after a while. Okay. So this printer daemon, if there is a process to print, it prints it, or if there are processes to print, it prints them. And then after printing them, of course, the next logical thing to do is it removes their name from the spooler directory. Okay. So now assume we have slots in this directory, spooler directory from 0 onwards, each holding a file name. And now we have two shared variables. So these are variables which are shared among all processes. So one of them is in. This points to the next free slot. So if you see the slide 7, what's the value of in? It's supposed to point to the next free slot. So the value is 7. What is out? Out points to the next file to be printed, which in this case is 4. So we have two shared variables, in, which points to the next free slot. In this case, the value of in is 7. And then we have out, which points to the next file to be printed, which in this case is 4. Okay. So that is clear, right? So now I am on slide 8, and this just puts into words what we have discussed. Right, process needs to print file, it enters file name in a spooler directory. Another process, a printer daemon, let's say the name of which is LPD, periodically checks if there are files to be printed. If so, it prints them and removes their names from the directory. Assume we have slots from 0 onwards, each holding a file name. Two shared variables, out and in. Out points to the next file to be printed, in points to the next free slot. Previous slide I have a snapshot of the directory. Next available slot is, we saw, which means the value of which variable, in or out? Value of in. So that is 7. Okay. So all that is clear from the previous slide. Okay, now I am on slide 9, and now we will discuss how we can have a synchronization problem in this printer queue example. So up till now, to recap, if you see the picture from slide 7, we see a spooler directory. The next available slot, or the value of the variable in, is equal to 7. And now both process A and process B want to write their file to the spooler directory. Okay. So the next available slot is 7, which means the value of the variable in is equal to 7. Now let's say at roughly the same time, processes A and B decide they want to queue a file for printing. So that's possible, many users are there. Let's say two of them decide that they want to queue a file for printing. So let's talk about process A. So it reads the value of in, which is 7, and it stores this value in its local variable called next free slot. So within the code for process A is a local variable called next free slot. Name is obvious. So value of 7 is copied to the local variable next free slot of process A. And now of course next thing it has to do is it has to write the name of the file in slot 7 so that it can be queued for printing. But what happens is, before process A can do that, an interrupt occurs, and now we context switch to process B. Okay. So perhaps process A's time slot expires or some event happens, and now we have a context switch to process B. So process A is interrupted. So now what will B do? Process B also wants to print. So it will also read the value of in, which is still 7, and store it in its local variable next free slot. So both process A and process B have their own version of variable next free slot, and both of them store 7 as that value. Now let's say B gets the CPU for a bit longer, and after copying 7 into its next free slot variable, it writes its file name into slot 7. So process B's file name is written to slot 7, and now it increments the value of in to 8. So B writes its file name into slot 7 and marks IN as 8. Now before it can do anything else, we have a context switch back to A. Okay. So main thing over here is when we have context switches, it is not so much in our control as it is in the control of scheduler, and context switch can happen any time. Right. In fact, if you are executing a set of processes 10 times, all 10 times you may get different execution sequences. Each process may get the CPU for different amounts of time. Nothing is guaranteed. It's non-deterministic. So now once IN has been marked as 8, now context switch happens back to A. So A resumes from where it interrupted. And what A will do is, last thing it was doing is it read the value of N and stored 7 in its next free slot. So what A will do is just resume from there. It will look at the value of the next free slot, which is 7 is what it had, and then it will write its file on that 7th slot. So is that advisable? Is that a good thing to do? Definitely not, because it overwrites B's file. As a result, B's file is not printed at all. So what happened? Once again, this unfortunate sequence of events. Process A read the value of IN, saw it as 7, copied 7 into its variable next free slot, local variable. Context switch to B. B read IN, saw the same value of 7, copied 7 into its local variable next free slot. Then it wrote its file name onto slot 7 and incremented next free slot to 8. Note that each process has its own next free slot variable. Right, so B writes its file name into slot 7 and marks IN as 8. And now context switch back to A, sees the value of next free slot 7, A writes its file name in slot 7, overwriting B's file. So therefore B's file is not printed. So clearly you can see there is no synchronization among these two processes. They are both accessing the same shared data, and because there is no synchronization, we have what we call data loss. B's file is not printed. Okay, so I hope this chain of events is clear. Right, end result is B's file is not printed. Okay, so what could we have done differently so that this would not have happened, so that B's data could not be lost? I will let you think about it, and we'll discuss it later. Clearly we need some kind of synchronization among the shared variables. So think about it. Okay, now I am on slide number 10, where we talk about the second synchronization problem. So previous problem was when we have multiple processes trying to print a file onto a shared printer. And if you think about it, we can see that the problem that happened was the concurrent execution of both process A and process B. If the execution was sequential, there would have been no problem, because process A wants to print, looks at the value of N, sees it as 7, puts the name of the file as 7, sets IN to 8, then process B comes in, sees the value of IN as 8, puts its file there, sets the value of IN as 9. So if the execution of process A and process B was sequential, then we would not have any problem. But because the execution is concurrent, therefore we may have interleavings between the execution of both processes. So that is when we have to be careful when two processes are executing at the same time and they are operating on shared data. If the execution is sequential, then clearly we have no problem. Okay. So now let's look at the second problem. This is a standard model for cooperating processes called the producer-consumer paradigm, or the producer-consumer or PC problem. So very simple, producer process produces information that is consumed by the consumer. As an example, a web server process produces HTML files, web pages that are consumed by web browser clients. Okay. One way that processes can communicate with each other is using shared memory. So we discussed this in chapter number 3. So we have two processes. They designate an area of memory as shared memory. They attach it to their address space, and then they can perform reads and writes on it. So a piece of memory which is shared for reading and writing by various processes. So using this, processes can communicate with each other. Process A writes to a shared memory. Process B reads from that shared memory. So our processes can use shared memory to communicate with each other. Okay. So now let's look at this producer-consumer problem. Okay, now I am on slide 11, where we will be discussing the producer-consumer problem in more detail. So once again, this is one of the classic problems of process synchronization. So we have two processes, one producing, other consuming. Okay. Now, what we are saying here is, they will both processes will communicate using shared memory, and this shared memory will have available a buffer of items that can be filled by the producer and emptied by the consumer. So you have sort of like an array or a buffer. Every time a producer produces an item, size of the buffer increases by 1. Every time a consumer consumes an item, size of the buffer reduces by 1. Okay. So possibility, a producer can produce one item while a consumer is consuming another item. Okay. So let's say there are 6 items in the buffer. Producer is producing the 7th item and consumer is consuming the first item. That's possible. Now what we are saying is the producer and consumer need to be synchronized so that the consumer does not try to consume an item that has not yet been produced. So there are a couple of situations which we need to be careful about in terms of synchronization. So what we have till now is we have a shared buffer that can be filled with items. Producer puts items on the buffer and consumer removes or consumes and removes items from the buffer. So a couple of situations we have to be careful about. The buffer is empty and the consumer is trying to consume an item. Clearly we don't want that. There is nothing to consume. So if the buffer is empty, what should the consumer do? In case of an empty buffer, it should wait. Wait for what? At least one item to be added to the buffer. Okay. So empty buffer, consumer waits. Is there any scenario in which the producer must wait? Yes, definitely. What if the buffer is full? So if the buffer has space for 10 items and 10 items are there, consumer has not consumed any of those 10 items, and now what should the producer do? Should it put another item? No. It should wait for the consumer to consume at least one item so that one hole is created and can put the item there. So in short, if the buffer is empty, the consumer waits. If the buffer is full, the producer waits. Okay. Okay, so now I am on slide 12. And one technique which we will employ is for the buffer is we will use a circular array data structure. Okay, so this is a bounded buffer. We assume that the buffer is bounded in size. So here we show a circular array of size what? Size 8. So indexes are 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So idea of a circular array is that end of the array wraps around to the start of the array. So you put an item and 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and after 7 comes 0. Well, similarly we consume in the same order 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 and then 0. Okay. So we use this circular array data structure to implement the bounded buffer. The producer puts items in the appropriate slot using the index, and the consumer consumes from the appropriate slot again using an index. Okay. Okay, so now I am on slide number 13. So now we employ two different pointers. Okay, just like we did for the shared printer. So one variable is in points to the next free position in the array. So in variable points to the next free position in the array. New items are added here. So initially value of in is 1, then you add an item, then in value is in is 0, then you add an item, in is 1, in is 2, in is 3 and so on. So in pointing to next free position in the array, new items are added here. Another variable out points to the first full position in the array. Item at out will be consumed before the other item since it is the head of the queue. Okay, so two variables, let's look at them once again. In pointing to the next free position in the array. New items are added here. Clear, simple. Next variable out points to the first full position in the array, which means the item at out will be consumed before the other items since it is at the head of the queue. Okay. Initially, what's the value for both in and out? Of course 0. So what will happen is, let's say a scenario. A producer quickly adds 3 items to the shared buffer. Adds item 1, what's the value of in? Initially 0, once producer adds the item it is 1. Another item added, second one, the value of in is 2. Third item added, value of in is 3. So 3 items in the buffer at indexes 0, 1 and 2, and value of in, next available free slot for adding the next item is 3. What is the value of out? 0. Then consumer consumes, then the value of out is 1. Consumer again consumes, value of out is 2. Consumer again consumes, value of out is 3. Buffer is empty, consumer has caught up with the producer. So every time the producer consumes, it increases the value of in. Every time the consumer consumes, it increases the value of out. Okay. So producer process, we'll soon see the associated code. It adds new items based on the value of in, current value of in. After adding the new item, the producer increases the value of in using the equation in is in plus 1 modulo buffer size. So we need the modulo because of the circular array. So the way it will add is 0 plus 1. So if the size is 8, 0 plus 1 by 8 is 1. 0 plus 2 by 8 is 2. 0 plus goes all the way. 0 plus 7 by 8 is 7. Then 0 plus 8 by 8 is back to 0. So because of this wraparound feature, we need the modulo operator. Okay. So note that since the array wraps around after it reaches its capacity, we need the modulo operator. Question is, when is the buffer full? So buffer is full when in has caught up with out. So you have 8 elements. You add 8 one by one and don't even consume any element. So the value of in changes from 0 to 1, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, all the way 7 to 8, 8 to 0. And now if you have not consumed even one item, value of out will also be 0. Okay, so when in wraps around and catches up with out, So note that value of in and out doesn't have to be 0. It could be 1, 2, 3, 4. Right. So the consumer is at value of out is 1, and then the producer keeps on producing, then after 0 it also reaches 1. Again full buffer. So buffer is full when n plus 1 modulo buffer size is equal to out. Okay, I hope that's clear. Now I am on slide 14. So producer will know whenever it produces an item, it increases the value of in using the equation in is in plus 1 modulo buffer size. And buffer is full when in catches up with out. N plus 1 modulo buffer size is out. Now consumer will consume items based on the value of out. After consuming, it will increase the value of out using out is same equation. Out is out plus 1 modulo buffer size. When will the buffer be empty? So buffer will be empty when the consumer catches up with the producer. So there is a difference. When will the buffer be full? Buffer will be full when the producer catches up with the consumer. Right? So probably the production is happening very fast and the consumption is happening very slow. As a result of that, the producer catches up with the consumer. N plus 1 modulo buffer size equal to out. Now, when will the buffer be empty? Well, the reverse. When the production is slow and the consumption is quite fast. Right? So in that case, buffer will be empty. So producer produces 2 items. From 0 it reaches 1 and then it reaches 2. And then very quickly the consumer consumes both items. Out reaches 0, 1 and then 2. So n is equal to out is equal to n. So the consumer catches up with the producer. So those are the buffer empty and buffer full conditions. Right? I hope it's clear. Okay, so now I am on slide 15, and in the next couple of slides, just to wrap up this lecture, we will look at an animation of how the queue is populated, circular queue is populated. Yeah. So here we have sort of Java code. We have our variables in and out. In depicting the let's go back and see. In depicting the next free position in the array. Next free position in the array is in, and out depicting first full position in the array. In is used by producer, out is used by consumer. So we have some Java code going on here. Q, the letter Q is new queue. Q.enqueue6. So add an item to the shared buffer. Insert at in plus 1 modulo buffer size. Right. So we have adding it 0, and what's the value of in now? It's 1. Right. Okay, hello everyone and welcome to. Okay, now I am on slide 16, and now we have a bunch of enqueue operations. Enqueue means to add to the queue, which in our case means to produce or to consume? To produce. So after 6 we produce 4, then 7, then 3, then 8. So how many items has the producer produced? 5. What is the value of in now? Pointed to the next free position. It's 5. Why? Because the value is starting from 0 and not 1. Okay. So here we see value of out is still 0. Value of in is 5, and we've added or we've produced 5 items. Okay. Okay. Hello everyone and welcome to a new chapter. Okay, now what do? So the history here is we have added 5 items to the queue, 6, 4, 7, 3, 8. Value of out is 0, value of in is 5. Now what we do is we remove 2 items. So 2 items are consumed. So which are those 2 items? Of course 6 and 4. Now after consuming 2 items, what is the value of out? Again we are doing out plus 1 modulo the size, right, which in this case is 6. So what is the value of out after the first item is consumed? 0 plus 1 modulo 6, 1. What is the value of out after the second item has been consumed? Right, latest value of out plus 1 modulo 6. 1 plus 1 modulo 6, 2 modulo 6, 2. So after consuming 2 items, value of in is 5 and value of out is 2. And then we once again add another element, 9, added at number at index 5, right, and I can see the array 9 is added at 5. Now the question is, what is we've just produced, so what changes? Value of in changes. Now what is the new value of in? It was 5, now at 5 we've added 9. What is the new value of in? So now I am on slide 18. In the last slide what we did was we had just added item with a value 9 to index 5. So what is now, we've added an item, so the value of n has to be increased. Now what is the new value? Is it 6? No. Right, it is in plus 1 modulo size. Value of in is 5. 5 plus 1 modulo size. 5 plus 1 modulo 6. 6 modulo 6, 0. So the value of n is 0. And then we add one more, right, nq5. So where will we add? We'll add 5 at the latest value of in, which is 0. And now the value of in is 1. Value out remains 2 because we only consumed 2 items. Okay. So I hope now this procedure should be clear. We have a circular array and we have pointers moving from 0 up till the end and then wrapping around back at 0. Okay. So I hope that how these pointers move, that part should be clear after looking at this Java code. Okay.